Okay, well, welcome. I'm Johnny O'Neill, the creative director for the Stormlight RPG, co-founder and president of Brotherwise Games, and I am joined today by three team leads for the Stormlight RPG, as well as I can also speak to questions about some of the other things we're working on, like the Mistborn deck building game. With that in mind, raise your hand if you are a fan of Stormlight. Okay, good.
Yeah, that tracks.
Sweet.
He's not sure.
Raise your hand if you're a fan of Mistborn. Okay.
I think it's it's the same hands.
That's a strong raise your hand if somebody sort of brought you along and you're here just to sort of see what's going on. Good, good. Yeah, don't be shy. Woo! Yeah, we call those future fans of Stormlight and Mistborn. And then raise your hands if you are an RPG player currently. Okay. Okay. Well, that's an excellent Venn diagram overlap here. And I guess if you're sort of a board gamer, if you like card games, board games, things like that. Okay. All right. Good. Good. Yeah. This is just okay. Unite them. So, well, good. Good. So that gives us a sense of who we're talking to today, and we're super lucky. We are all people who love these books and who get to every day work on them. I would like to have each team member introduce yourselves. We'll start with Katie right here and talk a little bit about who you are, what you do more generally, how you started working with Brandon-related stuff, and and your role on the team.
Hi, I'm Katie Payne. Johnny didn't know this before. Is this on?
That one's pretty powerful. So
that was very powerful.
Oh wow. Yeah, that one's
maybe too powerful.
I guess maybe it's
maybe if I
ready to be.
maybe if you share with Johnny.
Too much investiture.
Yeah, should.
Too invested.
All right.
How's this? Is this better? All right. Hi, Katie Payne. Johnny didn't know this before. He came and asked me to art direct these games that I actually, for like 10 years previously, worked in gaming. I worked in New York City. I worked at a few gaming in-house places. Gaming has been my big business for a while. I also happen to love the Cosmere. I love Brandon Sanderson stuff. I got into it like 12 years ago. My husband is the guilty person who got me into it, and just immediately obsessed, and I've been the art director and so yeah, if you like the art, good.
If you don't like the art, we don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, I don't want to hear it if you don't like it.
If you don't like the art, we don't want to hear it. Hi, I'm Lydia Swin. Nice to meet you all. I am the lead writer of Stormlight RPG. I got my start in creative as a developmental editor. I worked on games, comic books, and novels, and that was really fun. So I like thinking through plot a lot, and I really like the way that Brandon handles plot. And I'm just so excited to be working on this project. I'm a huge Cosmere fan, and Stormlight has a very special place in my heart. I really love very introspective stories about people who are complex and real. Just going through some stuff, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm also a lifelong gamer, so it's really cool to be working on this project. I've been working on RPGs for about 4 years now. Started with Adventures in Rokugan, which is if anyone knows what L5R is, worked on that IP for a while, and I'm just really excited to be a voice on this project.
All right, hey everyone. My name is Andrew Fisher. I'm the lead designer on the Stormlight Archive RPG. So I've been in the games industry for about 15 years. I got my start working on RPGs as well, with the Warhammer 40,000 RPGs, as well as the Star Wars RPGs. And that's kind of what brought me here, is all the work I got to do on kind of big IP role-playing games, right? Like figuring out how to take big settings and adapt them to these games. I've also done a bunch of work in board games at Fantasy Flight Games, as well as now at Earthborn Games, which we make a environmentally sustainable adventure card game. So we do that as well. But my previous work on role-playing games brought me here. I think probably similar to a lot of you, I read Sanderson long before I got this job, and like when you're reading all of his work, I couldn't help but imagine all of the game systems you know, whether it's like the Shattered Plains are like literally a board game, you know, all the way to all the different magic systems and how they're already kind of systematized. So, you know, I was already imagining game systems as I was reading through those books. So between that and my Star Wars experience, when this opportunity came up, I had to jump at it, and I'm so excited to be working on it. So.
So today's panel is going to focus mostly on taking your questions and answering them. But just to sort of give you a baseline of what we're talking about, I just had that up for when we were getting started. I have visual aids here if we need to reference anything from one of the books, that kind of thing. But we've got two big projects right now at Brotherwise. The first is the Mistborn deck building game. Katie and I have worked closely on that one, on all of the art for that. Some of the art for that will also end up in the RPG. That's how these things often work. You'll see it little on a card and then big on a page at some point. And then that was designed by a designer named John D. Clare, who's not at GenCon this year, but who is an incredible designer. His board game Geek page is a mile long. That is just a phenomenal game. It's demoing. Even if you can't get into a demo, you can at least check one out during the show, see that. And that's coming out November 7th. So that's this year. If anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to take them, or about the art for that. Katie is happy to take those questions. But we've got everybody here is working on the Stormlight RPG. And that is something that we know there are potentially a lot of questions about. That's hitting Kickstarter on Tuesday. Raise your hand if you're already following the Kickstarter page for that. Okay, excellent. If you're not, just do us a solid and follow that page. The more people follow that page, the more visible it gets to everybody else. And while I think we all assume it's going to do well, we'd like to do as well as possible, because the better it does, the more years and years of content we're going to be able to make for it. And that is our goal. Our goal is to make this one keep going for quite a while. So. Having said that, I would love to put some questions to you, the audience, and I'm going to try if I can just sort of call on people and have people speak loudly, and I'll repeat the question. But if that doesn't work, I also have a microphone to help cover the size of the room if needed. So, with that in mind, does anybody have any questions? All right, I'm going to go straight to the front row here.
So actually, my big question is, so I come from film and television. Adaptation is a challenge. What is your process in adapting books and narratives to the game system?
Yeah. All right. So the question there is, as somebody with a background in film and television, adaptations aren't easy, and I think that one's a feedback machine, unfortunately. So, what's the process? And I think this is a great question for maybe everybody on the team. I won't give every question to every person, but. Why don't we start with the question, from a game design perspective, from a narrative perspective, and then from an art perspective. That's really the three pillars of what we're doing.
Yeah, there's a few different angles that we come at adaptation from. There's obviously at like one of its most fundamental, you want to identify kind of the themes, the narrative themes that run throughout the work, right? Because ultimately, RPGs are a storytelling medium. So we want the systems to be telling the stories that feel like Stormlight stories, right? And so, we spend a lot of time in like what you might consider, literary analysis, kind of talking about what makes Sanderson's stories kind of tick, and what themes we want to evoke. We've actually got an awesome team member who also worked back on the Star Wars games with me, Max Brook. He's incredibly good at this kind of thing. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that and kind of what sorts of stories we want to evoke. That's very kind of base level, right? And then we start building systems and creating narrative structures around that. If you're curious about like more mechanical nitty-gritty, that's a lot more of like kind of an itemization challenge, right? Where we kind of look at the scope of all the different types of abilities we want to represent, all of the different iconic things that characters do, and obviously also meeting with Brandon, working with Brandon really closely to identify, some of the things characters do that we don't necessarily see in the books, so that the RPG is giving kind of a more complete picture of all the different abilities, since we don't see all the Radiant Orders like doing their thing as much as Windrunners and Lightweavers and stuff. But we try to kind of identify that scope of various abilities, and then you kind of take your needs of everything it needs to represent mechanically, and you kind of go back to your fundamental systems and ask yourself, can these cover all of our needs? And there's a term that gets thrown around a lot, which is like design space. And that basically means, what is the potential for this system to be kind of developed upon? And how much can you subdivide this system and create subsystems within it? And we try to identify, of our like base systems of the RPG, whether or not there's sufficient design space to represent everything we see in the books, right? Like, can we represent all the things gravitation can do, or whatever else in the games? And so there's kind of two different layers, right? There's that like kind of high-level narrative layer that we approach it from, but then there's also the very nitty-gritty practical, can we cover everything that's represented in this setting? The scope of that can be very challenging. Like, obviously Brandon's work is pretty expansive. This book just needs to cover Roshar, but Roshar is still like, the 10 surges and like gravitation, like, do you build a whole physics system? There's a lot of the challenges. So anyway, hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah.
So from a writing perspective, the most important thing for me to do was to make sure that all of you can feel like you are in Roshar, kind of in that protagonist place, like sitting at the table. And I wanted to make sure everybody could feel like they had the right support for their character to go on a journey like we see the main characters in the books go on. And so what this means from my end is that I need to make sure that the narrative framework is set up in a way that supports that. And my background in developmental editing helped a lot with this. I kind of know the peek behind the curtain of how that framework needs to look. And the goal is to make it really easy on everybody else who plays the game. Because whether you are a writer who writes a lot or you're not, the game just needs to make it simple. It needs to make it so that if you want to tell a really complex, introspective story with a lot of growth, all of the tools are already built in for you to have that character growth and kind of that progression, pun intended, I guess. But yeah, so that's really the heart of the story, is making sure that now Roshar is yours for the taking. Your character is able to be from any sort of ancestry or background that you wish. Now's your turn, it's really fun reading the books and learning about these characters. But for me, the fantasy of playing an RPG is like, now I get to write the main character. And I just feel like it's really important to have access to all of Roshar, know about the far corners of the countries. And just an example I give of one of my playtest groups is somebody was playing a character who's a disavowed Azish Imperial Shardblade. And I'm like, that's cool, let's tell those stories, Basically, if you think about interludes in character creation, I'm like, cool, what's your interlude, And then let's talk about where your character goes from there. So it's really fun because I work with the core design team, and we just make sure that all of the narrative mechanics are all of our ducks are in a row to just make sure that you can have the best experience and your character is set up for success from the beginning.
Thank you, Lydia. Yeah, from an art perspective, before I got on this project, I made a lot of fan art, and I would sell it at conventions, and people, the greatest moments when people would come up to me, emphatic, emotional, and they'd look at the art and they'd say, I can tell you didn't just read these books, but you felt the books. And with art directing, that has been the goal. It's been capturing, feeling every detail, and communicating to the artist who a lot of them haven't read the books. Add this, do this, and it's been phenomenal working with Johnny, because he has this same level, the same passion that I have felt for the artwork, from communicating back and forth and, oh, we can make this a little bit better this way. And he's like, absolutely, we could. And bringing like Lamary on the project, who is a lot of ways a lot of the soul of the visuals of the Stormlight, because she's made hundreds and hundreds of fan arts just out of pure passion because she loves the books. So bringing her on the project as a professional is part of why I'm really proud of this project. And I think, yeah, this is some spreadsheets done for us. I just, it's the soul of it's the text in visual format, and it's part of why I'm really proud of this project visually.
Yeah, that's one of the many team members who's not here today because she's in Germany. But Marie Seeberger, Lamaery is her tagline. If you've searched for Stormlight or Mistborn or Cosmere fan art, you've seen Katie's art, you've seen Marie's art, and she has this very kind of idiosyncratic style, sometimes a little sketchier, sometimes more painterly, but she just really gets at making this feel like a real world. And so one of the things we did in our world guide is we created these travelogue pages. Some of them are a single page, some of them cross 2 pages, but they're depicting, hey, here's a sort of a depiction of Yakaved, specifically Vadenar. Here is a sort of depiction of occupied Kolinar. And it just brings it to life in a way with like little notes and things like that. That growing up, I loved the book Dinotopia, which had some of that journal vibe to it. Very much that sort of thing. So that is very cool to see. So great question. That was a good kicking it off, because at the end of the day, how do we adapt this is the first and most fundamental question that we asked ourselves. So first of all, I will say we've got about 5 seats in front here. I think if you want to sneak it into one of them, especially if you've been here for a while, standing already, go for it. And now let's raise hands again and see. Let's see. All right, you've got a miscloak on. I got to answer. Yeah.
What was the biggest challenge of not only adapting a world where there's so many interconnected, everyone's going to be looking for an Easter egg, a certain talking sword that wants to destroy evil, but also a story that's ongoing, like a snapshot. When do you do this? Is it during the Way of Kings? Is it during Rhythm of War? Is it during the book that's coming out in November?
Yeah, great question. So part of this is asking when you want to set your campaigns. To some extent, this was something where I kind of provided direction. That's one of the things that they do the actual work. I sort of do some of the initial vision setting, and so with that, first of all, we wanted to make rules that will work in any era of Roshar. Obviously, we know more about the Era of Solitude and the True Desolation era. That's the time frame for which we have the most rich material, and what we're doing is sort of building on that. I will put this to maybe Lydia, just sort of what played into some of our decisions around timing, and then that question kind of about Easter eggs and details. What's our approach to that?
So one of the things we wanted to make sure you could do is, again, kind of have your character go through the story. And so we provide support for quite a bit of the way through the books. One thing for me in the world guide that was really important is giving a really clear picture of the nations and cultures before they're completely plunged into war, because there's a lot of cultural loss that takes place in war eras. And if you know how something is built up, then you can understand how it's kind of broken down. And we wanted to make sure that there's support for both of those things, whether you're playing very early on before folks are really knowing about the Return of the Knights Radiant and things like that, or if you're playing deeply immersed in the war with Odium. We wanted to make sure there was support for that. So the world guide, in terms of Easter eggs, we want to give them to you. Absolutely, we want to give them to you. The point of this game is that it's a self-insert, right? You get to be in the story, and for that universal fantasy to feel like you are really in this super cool world, you need to be able to poke around and talk to some NPCs, so I guess in that way, super important to be able to say, I don't know, in video games for me it's really annoying when there's that border that you can't cross, but you can look beyond it and you're there's something so cool there and I want it. It's dangling the carrot. And so for the world guide, very much the feeling was okay, but what if there weren't these arbitrary boundaries on where you could go? What if you had enough support to kind of build things out? And what if you could tell really cool, important niche stories in these places? And so I hope this like answers your question, but yeah, like Brandon's been amazing giving us a lot of those Easter eggs to just sprinkle all throughout Roshar, and we really hope that everyone has a lot of fun exploring and finding all of those.
Yeah, so we are launching with 3 books. So we have the handbook, which I've been showing imagery from here, the world guide, and then we also have an adventure, a hardcover adventure that is, yeah, let's see, we've got, this one, this is, I should say, all of these are prototype copies that are, this one is missing all the beautiful foil cover on it. These are things that we make to sort of review printing and layouts and things like that. So that's why I'm not showing them off even more, but they are fun to have and flip through. So the third book that we're making is the adventure. So we have a hardcover adventure called Stonewalkers, with a story that came to us from Brandon and Dan. And they also want to give you Easter eggs. They want to even answer some unanswered questions from the books. Let's see. I should have probably prefaced that there will be spoilers in this. I saw a lot of hands go up. I feel comfortable saying things like, general, I won't say character-specific spoilers, but sort of general plotline world-building stuff we'll get into. And in terms of adventure spoilers, I don't think it's too big a spoiler to say that, as an example, there's a character called Liss who pops up in Way of Kings and is never heard from again. She's a woman who is a shard bearer during that era of solitude. She seems to be an assassin, a secret agent of sorts. She speaks in different accents. She's interesting, but we don't hear from her again. But we do in Stonewalkers. Lydia mentioned poking around. You mentioned Nightblood. You might be able to poke around with Nightblood a bit in the Stonewalkers adventure. So, and that adventure takes place during Words of Radiance and continues through the Everstorm and takes you across Roshar. It gives you a chance to be in Western Roshar during a lot of the events that we see happening in the books in Eastern Roshar. So that's another neat thing. So yeah, those are some of the answers to your questions. The default sort of time period of the world guide, it references the pre-war, or at least pre-war against Odium state of the world, but it is set during the year after Oathbringer, which is a very rich year for storytelling. It's a year when a lot of society is in upheaval, and a year where there's just so many rich storytelling possibilities. So that is, Marie's travelogue images, for example, depict cities as they appear. Vadenar is shown in the aftermath of the Vaden Civil War, that kind of thing. So, all right, another question. I'm going to go furthest in the back with the, furthest sitting person in the back. That's you, yes.
When the Mistborn role-playing game came out, we got short stories, Allomancer Jack, 11th Metal, and Secret History. Are we going to be getting a Rosharan short story with this one?
So I would say that the time and effort that Brandon put into those short stories, he has instead put into making the RPG itself canonical in this case. So while I would love to say, yes, there would be short stories in this, in a way, we didn't feel that was sort of necessary to sort of hook people into getting these books. We've got the beautiful art that Katie has art directed. We've got the work that Brandon has put into making it canonical. And that is, he has a limited amount of time. One of my jobs is to make sure that I'm not taking away from time he needs to spend writing books. And he's more busy now than he was 10 years ago when the Mistborn Adventure game came out. So we've taken that time and effort and energy and funneled it into what you see here. So that's how that is. Yeah.
Well, and to your answers to the last question, it's not Brandon prose necessarily. The Stonewalkers is a Brandon story. Yeah. And so you'll get to, you won't necessarily be reading a new Brandon short story. You will be playing one. And we are, it's not just a PR line. It tells a story that bridges a gap and tells a story that Brandon wasn't able to find a place for anywhere else. And so you do get to experience new Brandon narrative, just in a slightly different way this time.
Yeah, and Brandon lore. So rather than the RPG being sort of an extrapolation as it was for that project, where he had to distance himself a little bit from some of the canonicity of it, this is this content's going in the copper mine. This content is happening, coming from Brandon. So it's real, but it's all fantasy. Okay, that was a very quick hand raise. You must have a good question.
Yeah. So I kind of want to kick it back to you. I know that designers, they're proud of the big things. They have to talk about the larger things. But I want to know, what is a specific detail of a win that you had that you're excited about and proud of in the creation of the Stormlight RPG that you don't think you'll otherwise get to talk about? Like, tell me something that makes you a little bit giddy.
That's a nice question. I'll let. I think each of you should have a chance to answer that in whichever order goes first. What's a win that you had on
A
this
little
project?
one that I wouldn't talk about aside from being specifically asked that question. There's a vignette of Liv, and she has her shark fork. That's it. I'm so pleased. Yeah.
For me, a little win is that we provide iconic build recommendations. It's sort of like a quick start. So if you're like, hey, I want to play a Vorten, an Ardent, or if you want to play, what's another really good one? We have a Shardbearer Duelist, or a lot of just the iconic things that you see in the game. We have
an Ukulaki Kalo.
Yes, actually loved working on that one. Thank you, Johnny. Because briefly, Rock had mentioned this to Kaladin, once we've kind of gone farther, then I'll call you that. But you haven't earned that title yet. And so it was really fun working with Brandon and his team and trying to figure out okay, but who is this though? And so if I'm allowed to say where we landed on with that,
yeah, sure.
We're just maybe there are really cool matriarchal huntresses who live in the wild and are able to scale the Horneater peaks and know how to do that and have developed the survival instincts to just to really feel the environment and know. So it's let's take these tiny little very niche things from the books, again, that are barely mentioned, and let's build that out and get the information from Brandon that we need so people can bring that into their games. So little things like that, the iconic builds are really fun for me just because a new system can be kind of stressful if you're thinking about the story in a very expansive world, and it just immediately, if you want to play any of those iconic builds, you can just jump right in.
So my example, I can't give you nitty gritty specifics just because we're still in we're doing the beta right now for the game, and we're still working with Brandon. As Johnny mentioned, this game being canon is really important to us. So we're still working with Brandon on some of making sure that all the places we're stretching beyond the novels a bit, is canon in his books. But I think some of my favorite moments was working on the surges with our design team. So the way the surges work in the game is they kind of work like a skill. You can roll a skill test and use that surge to in different creative ways, and it gives tools for the GM to kind of adjudicate how that works. But we also give talents that you can unlock, a tree of talents in that surge that kind of represent the special abilities that characters, figure out by how they use, gravitation or whatever. But as I said earlier, some of the surges we don't see in the books that much yet, right? And obviously, we're going to see more in book 5, and Brandon was able to share a lot of that with us. But there are gaps where, we haven't seen a ton of how a given surge is used, and there are these moments where we got to go to Brandon and say, okay, this surge could do these things. Could you use it in this creative way? And one of the, I've worked with a lot of licensors over the years, right? And often when you're working on a big IP and a license, it's all about keeping everything kind of rigidly within the source material, within what's defined, right? And Brandon, and that's kind of what I expected working with Brandon, but Brandon engages with everybody he works with and trusts them. And he would so I expected, we'd go and start talking to him about how to use these different surges and everything. And I expected, okay, well, this is how it's used in the books, therefore this is how it has to be used. And his eyes would light up and be like, oh yeah, no, you could totally do that, right? And and so those were some of my favorite moments. So I can't share the exact ones. There's some intention that we got to figure out exactly how tension is working. And So I can't share the specifics. So you have to kind of wait for the book. But those are probably my favorite moments.
Those little creative solutions and ways that you can even show Brandon out.
Yeah, and and kind of use his own internal rule set, like his characters might. It's just fun.
I have an answer to that question too. I got to, by which I mean I decreed that I could write the table of blessings and curses examples for visiting the Night Watcher, and so that is and I went. In general, this is a very modern RPG design ethos kind of game. It's cutting edge crunch, cutting edge narrative tools. But I went old school deck of many things like Gary Gygax with that, and it's pretty fun. So, all right, another.
He really went in on that
question.
one.
All right, I'm gonna go headband.
So most of my experience is in 5e, but I've played some of the Star Wars RPG, which you mentioned before, and so I'm thinking specifically the relationship between the GM and how they're kind of facilitating the narrative with the players.
Yeah.
And, can you speak to that and what they're working on, or how you envision the GM interacting with the players?
So that question was around. Great question in terms of having played D&D 5e and Star Wars, which are two games that definitely had a big influence on this, and two games that we know well. In Star Wars, there is a relationship between the GM and the players, where the players are invited to participate a little bit more in some of the building the narrative. There are some games that do that even more, like Powered by the Apocalypse, Fate System. And sort of where do we sit on that? What are some of the considerations that we made? I'll pitch that to both Andrew and then to Lydia.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And so a lot of you are probably aware, but for those of you who aren't, one of the the core mechanic of our game, we use a d20 to kind of figure out how different skills resolve. But then we also have the plot die, which is a custom die. Or you can use a d6 very easily. A lot of our design team just rolls d6s, and it works really well. So the plot die, on tests that are important or tense, you roll it alongside the d20, and it has two different symbols: an opportunity or a complication. And these can be used to trigger beneficial effects or negative side effects in the game. So for those of you familiar with the Star Wars role-playing game, we had similar narrative resources there. And one of the things we really found with these is, they give mechanical permission to the players to inject kind of interesting details into the story that would normally be the purview of the GM. We definitely kind of keep a delineation of authority that some more, loose narrative games might not necessarily. GMs always have the final say on how you spend a complication, and players always have the final, or whoever rolled the opportunity has the final say on how you spend an opportunity. But we really encourage collaboration around the table of, pitch me on what this could do, right? And one of the things we've really found is when players start really getting into the system, players will pitch their own complications, and it's do I fall into the chasm? And then the GM's yeah, you do. And so that is kind of our main toolbox for handing some narrative agency to the players. But there's many other places we're doing it as well, especially in kind of the talent and ability development. And that's the other place is you'll see a lot more abilities in the game. While we have a decent amount of crunch, you'll see abilities that hand storytelling permission to the players. An ability that might not necessarily give you a statistical buff, a numerical buff in combat, but instead says, all right, player, you have permission to just show up and say that you have connections to, an unnamed illicit organization in this area, right? And you're able to kind of inject that detail into the story, and your abilities are giving you permission to do that.
One of our design pillars was to balance the crunch with a rich narrative fabric. And so when you're talking about really intentional storytelling or very expansive storytelling, you're also kind of building in a little bit of cognitive load to all of that. And so it's really nice when you have the tools set up to make this like an exciting experience that people can collaborate around the table for, because like what is tabletop role playing if it's not like shared storytelling, right? And one thing that is really helpful with the plot die is like personally I have ADHD. I don't know where my neurospicy crowd is. I see you. But for me as a developmental editor, I learned this is actually my superpower, because I can tell you exactly which page and like which line my eyes kept reading but my brain checked out, right? And so for games, I'm like, I need a game that is engaging enough where my brain always stays checked in and everybody at the table is like not on their phones, like we're all engaged. And the plot die is a really cool way to do that. You don't use it on every test, but about a third of tests it'll make its way in, especially like toward the end of a session when a lot of things are happening. And just having that moment where everybody like gasps because like it's like, oh, like we're really down on our luck and we got an opportunity, and having that moment where everybody around the table is like, oh, okay, like we really maybe need it for this. Or a lot of times people have really quirky, really fun ideas. That's just a way to get everybody at the table re-engaged, and it's just like magic, because like we all know what happens to a campaign, even if it's a beloved one, when people start checking out, you know, like emotionally or mentally. Those games just fall apart. Scheduling's such an issue, and so to have a game where the mechanics and you know the narrative fabric just encourages these constant moments of like engagement and emotional like you know resonance with all of the players, I think is kind of like a huge boon to us.
I if you don't mind,
No, go for it.
I think one thing you said is you mentioned cognitive load, which I think is a really good point. Like that was actually a big challenge with representing Roshar, especially, is the cognitive load on the GM for telling stories here, because you know if you have Radiance, you're introducing. So you have a party of 5 Radiants, you're introducing 5 new NPCs, right, in the form of Spren. And not only that, but to the earlier point, introspection is a big part. You know, like Brandon has like literally mechanized introspection through the ideals. And so, you know, we needed to do the same, and like telling 5 different introspective stories to your 5 players, combined with the NPCs they might, you know, these Spren, combined with all the normal challenges. Massive cognitive load on the game master. And so empowering the players was actually an important part of making these stories possible, because otherwise the GM has this giant undertaking to tell all this story and bring it together in the Sanderlanche in the end of the adventure. And so by handing some permission to the players for handling their Spren, the Spren, get more detail, but it's more of a collaborative process between both the GM and the player whose Spren it is to roleplay that Spren and control them, but also handing the tools to the players to handle their kind of introspective journey and mechanizing that in how our advancement works. So reducing cognitive load was like giving more narrative permission to the players was actually pretty critical to make this, to tell these kind of stories without making our GM super stressed.
Awesome. All right. Another question. Let's see. Back row, raised hand there. Yes.
So you talked about how you have like the players and like the manual and like the world and everything. Do you have plans to make like a monster manual kind of thing? And what would be the most powerful creature in that monster manual? And why is it important?
Yeah, what is our monster manual? What's our equivalent to that? So actually, that is in the world guide. So the world guide is partly just the encyclopedia and art book of Roshar that you've always wanted. It's something that I expect a lot of non-RPG players to buy. But the final chapter is our adversary profiles, which have stat blocks for all the iconic creatures of Roshar, as well as some of the key, as well as sort of various adversaries like, you know, spear infantry or, you know, Bright Lord or various things, kind of people you might encounter. So in terms of the most powerful currently in, I think this is actually a pretty easy answer. Do you recall what it is?
No, go ahead.
It's the if it's in the I believe it's in the final, but the Servant of Yelignar.
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
so we've got at the end of Oathbringer, a particular villain has swallowed a gemstone containing Unmade, empowering them with like 9 of the surges. That's a like super high level threat. But then also what are a couple of the other high level threats that are in that?
Well, I mean, Chasm Fiend, Thunderclast, right? But like, they're powerful, but there are threats that are a little more potent. They might not have the raw power of a Chasm Fiend or a Thunderclast, but there are some other threats that have, like, to the point of the Servant of Yelignar, there's some abilities that get a little more potent than that. To the Hoid thing, though, I think that's an interesting question of, like, how do you represent these bigger than life narrative characters? Like Hoid, who, his stat block should probably go well beyond a Stormlight Archive RPG,
Yeah.
And that's always an interesting question in any of these big IPs. And so you probably won't expect to see Hoid in the Monster Manual equivalent in our World Guide, right?
Yeah.
Instead, you will see characters, a lot of powerful and iconic characters make appearances in our adventures.
Yeah.
But also, you'll see the rules you need to represent that character in that adventure, right? But you might not necessarily see, that's like one aspect of that character, right? Like, Hoid's stat block is probably pages long. And so presenting that in one dump might be a little unwieldy.
Yeah.
So
I'm in charge of getting to say spoilers in this. So I will say that you will get to meet, for example, Nail in the Stonewalkers campaign, and that is, we don't provide a stat block for him. I think we refer to we've got a 4th Ideal Skybreaker stat block, and sort of say, hey, if they want to try to fight them, use this, but scale it up. But of course, you shouldn't try to fight Nail. Don't do that. Yeah, like just like you shouldn't try to fight the Chasm Fiend in Bridge 9. So just spoiler alert. There are some things that you really should just be nice to or run away from. So yes, that is something where you'll see more of that as we proceed. But those are some tidbits there. On this side of the room, I feel like I've neglected. Here we have Glasses, gray shirt.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Lydia, earlier you mentioned not wanting to have to bump up against that invisible wall at the edge of the playable area. I'm curious if there's the ability to journey beyond Western Roshar, perhaps where this first adventure happens, and find your way into the cognitive realm.
Ooh, yeah. So the question there is, can you venture into the cognitive realm?
Am I allowed to answer this, Johnny?
Yeah.
We do have some support for the cognitive realm. I won't get into the exact specifics of that yet. It's kind of an exciting thing. Stay tuned in the World Guide for that. But yeah, you do get to poke around, and we kind of explain how things work, and just providing that GM support, so you can further flesh things out. But yeah, absolutely. Like when I talk about being able to poke around the corners of Roshar, like we learn about so many nations that are only ever mentioned like literally once or twice by name in the entire series. And like we learn about like what's their economy like, or like what are their trade relations with other nations like. And so answering these kinds of questions, GMs are really empowered to bring people there and tell interesting stories there, because now you can take any tiny little hook Brandon left open in like these huge books, right? And you can say, we're gonna tell the story of what's going on behind the scenes here. The Coalition of Monarchs, it's like, well, this is the information, that Dalinar's getting, but what was the discussion behind the scenes that made that happen? And so you can really just, like, it's been so fun to just look for those tiny hooks, and we've done it a lot in internal playtests, and just said, we need to make sure that, again, like, the information we provide on, like, the different areas you can explore and stuff, that everything supports the idea of just finding a little hook and running with it as a group.
Yeah. So we do have support for Shadesmar in the rules. I will also say, though, that that's an area that I'd love to expand further in the future. Just like there's no cap on levels in the system, the level progression table goes 1 through 20, then 21 plus, and tells you what happens as you progress past that. But that sort of play, which does start to get into more of that like herald level of power, that is something we could expand on in future supplements. Not necessarily the next thing we do, but there's room for us to expand further into that area. So yeah.
Shadesmar could be its own book.
Yeah, it really could. So we've got thoughts in that direction. All right, next question.
With that thought about expanding in the future, would you consider this RPG being open to including other worlds, other investiture systems one day, or is it going to remain focused on Roshar? And if focused, how will you deal with world hoppers?
Right. So I will say that obviously expanding beyond Roshar into the Cosmere is something that we would really like to do. I think it's something that raise your hand if you would like to see us do that. Okay. Yes. All right. So that is something that I would say let's do our best to make this as big as possible and see where we can go from here. And in terms of world hoppers, just to give a specific nugget, there is, for example, a Ghost Blood stat block in the adversary guide. So and it doesn't provide full rules for how this person is able to power up and become stronger and faster than normal, but it's giving you that at least element of the world. So it's a little bit like being Marvel and having access to Spider-Man or something. So all right. Let's see. I haven't gone over here in a little while. Let's see. Okay, purple shirt.
So long-time role-playing gamer.
Yeah.
Back for Star Wars back when everyone was Wizards.
Yeah.
You guys just got the IP license for doing Cosmere stuff. It seems like, and there's so many stories to tell. How are you planning to continue to further expand either like with other card games, Mistborn card games
Yeah.
coming out, or future developments?
So a question there that this is an IP that could have as much, especially as we're looking at the Cosmere overall across the games that Brotherwise can make. Comparing it to Star Wars, which has had so many amazing games that have been made for it, how do we look at that, and what are some of the places we could potentially go? We've got the Mistborn deck building game, which is awesome. I really think it's, from a board game perspective, it's the best looking and best playing game that Brotherwise has made. And I think will be one of the best deck building games ever. That is just, even for people who aren't familiar with the IP, it's just really good. And then we've been demoing a game, a smaller, sort of simpler game, but still a fun one, a trick-taking game called Shards of Creation that Katie has been illustrating, and that's a fun one that we're working on. We are also working with John D. Clare, who designed the Mistborn deck building game, on an epic Stormlight game along the lines of a War of the Ring or a Star Wars Rebellion. So that's something that a lot of people have asked for, and that is also shaping up really, really well. Like Andrew said, it's these books were written by a gamer, and so they're made to be games. So yeah. All right. Let's see. Mouse ears? Or catty?
Well, so we talked a lot about the RPG. We haven't talked much about the Mistborn deck building.
Yeah.
Just reference. I demoed it yesterday. It was great. So I just wanted to know if there was anything about the development process.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I liked the concept of burning and flaring metals and how you managed to figure that out and balance it. So it seemed like a lot.
Yeah. Thank you for asking a Mistborn deck building game question. That is. I'd love for Katie to talk a little bit about the art side of it. I'll say from a game development side, the sort of key twist in that game compared to other deck building games, like other deck building games, there are cards in the center of the table. You start with a really basic deck of cards, and you are able to purchase cards to take them into your deck and improve your deck as you play the game. So the metal burning is kind of a new wrinkle in deck building, where you have metals, you can only burn a certain number of metals every turn, and so you have to decide, am I going to burn this metal to activate this card or burn this metal to activate that card in my hand? I really want to do both, but I can only choose one, or I could flare a metal and be able to play both of the cards I want to play now, but that flared metal I'm not going to be able to then use on that next turn. So that very, it's games are all about meaningful choices. The Stormlight RPG is full of meaningful choices, but that meaningful choice just unpacks a ton of cool gameplay. And the best comment that we got is somebody walked up and said, I felt like I didn't even need to look at the rules because as a Mistborn fan, I knew how to play. I'm not sure that's actually an accurate assessment. You need to look at the rules. But it was the idea that what you know about the books translates directly. The theme translates into mechanics that's great to see. That's definitely what we shoot for. But this is also the most Mistborn art that's ever existed in one place. Certainly the most official color Mistborn art in one place. I think I'm probably wrong, but if there were 25 color official canonical Mistborn illustrations prior to this game, now there are 175. So can you talk a little bit about making these awesome images?
Yeah, for the art for the game, for each card, we look at it and go, okay, it's brawl. So what's happening here? And we would turn to the books and try to dig out a scene from the book where someone's brawling, but then go one step further. Well, how can we make it fan service? So so like for example, there's a card named Spy, and okay, how can we spy? Who's spying? Well, okay, so how about that one time Zane was vertical on Vin's balcony, and we kind of mushed it around a little bit, but it's a little bit of fan service. He's vertical and she's up there, and so it's really cool. The art also it's illustrative of the books, and it's also canonical. Everything was reviewed by Dragonsteel once a week. Make sure everything was canonical. The cloaks canonical. Vin's face canonical. It's Vin's hand pose when she's pushing or pulling canonical. So and right down to details like the sky. We had a lot of fun making sure the sky is not blue, never blue. We found a few blue skies, caught those before it went to print. It's a red sky. It's a deep blue night. So the art is. You should look at it and feel some elation or joy if you're a big fan of the book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So we are getting close to the end of our time. So I'm going to just answer a couple more questions. Hands up one more time. Okay, we haven't done this side. I'm going to go far back there, closest to the wall. Yes, that's you.
So to go back to the Stormlight.
Yeah.
My primary experience is in D&D 5e, where almost everybody I play with is kind of wishy-washy with the lore, and I can push and pull and manipulate it as much as I want. Whereas with something like this, the people I'm playing with have read the books and know it as well as I do. And out of respect for the material, I feel like it would be difficult for me to craft a story. I love the idea of running them through something that's happening in the books. I'm super excited that you're creating an adventure.
Yeah.
I've touched on it a little bit, but what are some other kind of tools that GMs could use to craft their own stories?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I see Lydia already leaning forward. So the question was, for folks on this side of the room, how do you come up with new stories in this world that has such specific and canonical stories? And one thing I will say is that some settings are better for this than others. One of the reasons why Star Wars has so many games is because from the moment you walk into the cantina on Tatooine, you have the sense of, oh, this is a wider world. There's more than one story happening. There isn't one Jedi Knight, especially if you're in the Old Republic or prequel era. There's a lot of them. And so here, there isn't one Radiant. There's a lot of them. And so Brandon has spoken to the fact that the interludes are permission to say there's other stories going on here. So what are some of the tools that we give people to craft new stories in this world? And is there anything else, any other recommendations along those, aside from the official published adventures, which do make it a little bit easier, and which I recommend buying, even if you don't, I recommend buying all of our things, but I recommend getting that even if you don't intend to run it, because you can pillage it for encounters and stat blocks and ideas to put in your own adventure. But Lydia.
Really great question, by the way. So when we're talking about narrative design, like you said, this is just such an expansive world. The stories that Brandon tells about people are so intricate. It's like, how do you get that experience at the table? Just again, kind of from the editing background, you have characters and you have settings. And the setting of Roshar is really interesting, but the characters are what make the story. And so I've heard, like, I'm not an artist, but I've heard that in art, if you've stared at a picture you're working on too long, like a painting or something, if you take a picture of it and reverse it, or you flip it upside down, you can kind of like, you kind of see it with new eyes. And so
I flip it like 1,000 times before I'm done.
So with the setting, it's like you're looking at your character, right? And Roshar is almost a way of like flipping this around and looking at a character in a very different situation or a different setting, kind of with new eyes. And so while the setting is really important, the character takes center stage. And the way that we did this with the narrative design was having goals. And so every character will have a purpose, which is kind of what drives them, an obstacle, which is a constant, you know, a misbelief or a character flaw that they're up against trying to overcome. And then those are fixed, whereas you have goals, which throughout the story, this is how you make sure, again, you tell those introspective stories for 5 different people at the same time, and everybody's getting limelight, everybody's getting space at the table to tell their stories. So the goals, you could have any type of goal for your character, and once you progress those goals throughout the game, you're able to unlock really cool rewards. And where, 5e has a lot of loot, loot isn't really as much of a thing in Stormlight as sort of like character growth, and so we handle this through those goals, through checking off throughout gameplay, and it really encourages characters around the table and GMs to work together to make sure those stories are being told. And the rewards could be anything from like swearing radiant ideals and working up there, which is super cool, to on the heroic side, because you can also tell the stories of characters who are not radiants for whatever reason, and I love that. And their rewards are very cool. Like Rashadiums, Shardblades, yes. You know, like whether you're like, okay, have the diagram as a patron, I don't know. Like whatever that story, whatever that story is, like, hi, I love this. But those goals are our way of signaling and signposting to the GM and characters, make sure we are all weaving these different stories together. And I think when you have Radiants who all have different orders and different like objectives for their growth, sometimes that leads to some interesting inter-party conflict, right? If their ideals are kind of conflicting, and that's how you weave all of this together, like Sanderson, like Avalanche style, into a really beautiful game that does not overly tax the GM or players on their cognitive load, and you're always making progress along the way. Everyone's getting attention.
It's cool listening to some of the answers to this question, questions like these. It makes me realize, role-playing games are this crazy blend of rules and playing pretend, right? They reward people who care about math and statistics. They reward people who care about improv theater, and that wacky blend of the thing. I've had people walk up to me and say, "Wow, like I love like mechanically intricate, crunchy games, and this I didn't realize this would have that. Oh, thank you for that." And I've had other people come up to me and be like, "Oh, I really love like narrative games that really empower storytelling, and it's less about like the rules." And thank you for giving us that in this game. And I think the thing is, we just have a lot of both. And whichever side of the role-playing spectrum you favor, you can lean into that in this game. And so the character building stuff is there. And that is a great way to tell new stories in this world, because it is down to the character. And yeah, you're fighting Regals and Fused and evil humans and all of these different characters and creatures and things that are in this world. But it is fundamentally the most exciting thing is just seeing how these characters develop and swear their ideals and interact with one another. And there's a lot of stories to be told there. So I have 2 last things. We're down to 1 last question. But I want specifically, people have asked very nice general questions that give us a chance to give our spiels. But somebody try to give us like a weird mechanical question.
Oh no.
All right. And then the last thing is, I would like to take a little video of everybody in the room like cheering and acting excited, so we can send this to our families and be like, "This is what we do for a living." So, all right. You looked very excited. Yeah. You're right in my line of sight.
Sorry. The screen are very important part of the Stormlight board.
Yes.
So I'm curious if there are any plans to add them as a mechanical or narrative element into the RPG.
Okay, so Spren, Spren as a mechanical element. Are they just a storytelling tool, or can you do anything mechanical with them, Andrew?
Yeah, you can do some mechanical things with your Spren. So your Spren start off, they start off as a narrative tool when you first start kind of interacting with them. But as you progress your goals and your ideals through your goals in the game, and form your bond with your Spren. They have several different abilities that represent, the distance they can get from you, the things they can do within that distance, and you can spend focus, which is kind of our mental resource, to interact with your Spren and gain benefits from them being able to go and spy for you or whatever else, right? So you have those kind of base uses of your Spren as you and the GM collaborate to roleplay them. But beyond that, you have a path that represents your Radiant Order. There's 3 sections of that path. 2 are your surges, and the 3rd one is your bond with your Spren. And so that contains your new ideals that you're going to progress, but it also contains things like the resonances between your 2 surges, as well as ways to improve your bond with your Spren, whether that be increasing the range or giving you new capabilities based on the different types of Spren and what they can do. So you're going to have some base abilities, and then you're going to have some talents that can upgrade it, kind of depending on the flavor of Spren you've got.
So the answer is yes. Well, thank you so much for being here. I think we have to wrap things up so folks can get over to the convention, but a couple of us will be here if you want to ask us questions.
Johnny did an AMA on Reddit.
That's true, yes.
Yeah.
If you want more details, I did an AMA on Reddit r/Stormlight RPG. Andrew's going to do one on Friday of next week, on the 10th, I think it is. So that's coming up on r/RPG. And so there are more chances to ask us questions.